Okay, we'll now get started. So welcome everyone to the University of Texas Energy Symposium for October 27th, 2020. Today we have Damon Drummer of New Consensus, but before I introduce him fully and he will give us a background on his organization, we'll have more of a conversational style discussion today. Just like to point out that next week we will have no energy symposium as that is election day and figured people might be otherwise busy. And we'll start again the following week, November 10th, with David Spence of our law school here at the University of Texas with a little bit of climate and policy kind of discussion, perhaps touching on whatever we might know from the election results at that time. But today, it's my pleasure to have Damon Drummer, who's a co-founder and executive director of New Consensus. We're going to talk about the Green New Deal and the role of public investment in an energy transition. So just a brief background on Damon before I let him introduce himself further and his organization. He is a co-founder and executive director of New Consensus. They are a think tank aiming to solve problems such as climate change, economic stagnation, racial and rural wealth gaps by proposing solutions modeled after the mass mobilizations efforts of the past in the United States and other places. So he's exploring how government and other public institutions can lead the transition to a green economy, close wealth and income gaps between groups, spearhead innovation, and kickstart new high-wage industries. So he is living in Chicago, so he's an organizer and civic innovator who has his roots in Chicago and has been recognized by the Obama administration, Code for America, and the Aspen Institute. I will just point out to the students on the list that the Longhorn Energy Club is hosting Damon afterwards for a continued discussion and one-on-one. So you can contact longhornenergyclub.com here, and the Zoom link is shown here, and we could potentially share that in the chat. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Damon to further introduce himself and his organization and their ideas. And then after that, we will have a bit of a discussion. So please ask questions at any point via the Q&A feature of Zoom rather. Ask a question at any time, and we will work to bring in these questions throughout our conversation today. So Damon, go ahead and start sharing your screen and tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll start our conversational.
Got it. Let me go ahead and start this presentation, and we can see the screen, right?
Everything looks good. Thank you.
All right, great. So thank you, Carey, for the invitation to join the UT Energy Symposium. Very excited to be part of this conversation and this series of discussions. UT has a special place in my heart. My father is an alumnus of the University of Texas. He was actually the first Black battalion commander of the Army ROTC Cadet Corps. And every time we drove from Fort Hood, Texas to his hometown of San Antonio, we stopped at UT because he wanted his sons to go to UT. So I was doing college tours very early in my life. So just happy to be here. And I'll touch briefly on what New Consensus is and spend the balance of this very brief kind of overview introduction discussing how we understand the Green New Deal and I think our contribution to the public discourse around public investment to accelerate the transition to a renewable energy future. But New Consensus is a relatively new think tank established to actually solve problems. We develop plans and proposals to tackle a range of issues that have bedeviled this country since its founding, if not for a long time. These include issues like economic stagnation, particularly in the time that we're in now, racial and kind of regional wealth gaps that have persisted and have their roots in like a deep and, I would say a very deep history in this country, but also climate change. And we believe that in order to actually tackle climate change, in order to tackle economic stagnation and like the escape and exodus of manufacturing in this country. The way to tackle all these problems that are happening at the same time is to solve them in a way that tackles these problems at the same time. They're interrelated. And so, whereas other think tanks may focus on one piece of the puzzle, like labor or economics in general, what we try to do is connect the dots around a range of issues and hopefully craft comprehensive solutions. And not that we can solve all problems all the time, but those problems that we can solve, we believe ought to be solved. And so what we're known for is coming up with proposals that are considered pretty big. And that's only because the problems that we are attempting to solve are big. Climate change is a big issue. And so I think the solution should be proportionately big, and it's happening pretty quickly. And so the solution should be at the scale and speed and urgency of the crisis itself. So, and so to kind of close the loop on new consensus, what we do is, because our solutions tend to be pretty big, we have to root the solutions in the history of this country. The US, America, our country, used to not shy away from doing big things. And if there were problems, we would, I laugh because it's for us, it's just about being practical, right? And if you suspend politics for a moment, you can actually solve a range of problems and a range of issues. But alas, we have to actually engage in the political process. But setting that aside, the history of our country is quite rich with very interesting mobilizations of resources. Most of those spurred by public investments, right? There's a musical that's very popular for the last 5 years or so, Hamilton. And people love the musical, but they forget the model that he presented for this country in making public investments for infrastructure and other things that really set the direction and charted the course for America to be a dominant economic power. And so we try to frame these issues to be, or rather frame our solutions to be, not unprecedented in the history of the country. And so I'm here to talk about the Green New Deal a bit. And, the Green New Deal, although it has the phrase New Deal in it, the true inspiration for the Green New Deal is the World War II mobilization, which is often forgotten history in the US. As you know, before the US entered World War II, the country had the industrial capacity to build about, I think it was like 3,000 airplanes. They were at the time, artisanal kind of niche products that were built by hand. When FDR looked at the possibility of entering war and the material needs to wage such a war, among other things, he concluded that we needed at least 300,000 warplanes, or 289,000 or something like that, about 300,000 warplanes. And of course, the war planners kind of looked at him and laughed, because the country simply did not have the industrial capacity to build that many warplanes. So what FDR did was connect folks from Detroit, from the automakers who knew how to do that mass production on that Ford model, and connected them with folks who knew how to build airplanes. And when it was all said and done, actually, before I get to that point, and not only that, who was going to fund these factories? Well, in some cases, companies were able to build factories. In others, factories had to be retooled with public money, right? In other cases, the government built factories and then contracted with private companies to run those factories. So the point was, massive public investments created the industrial capacity for the US to not only build warplanes for World War II to wage war and beat fascism abroad, but to build helmets and parachutes and things like that. And so converting industrial capacity on the one hand, building new industrial capacity, and then financing the whole kit and caboodle across the country, that is what it took to be the arsenal democracy, right? And so we see this, clean energy demand, and I would say this urgent demand to move aggressively to clean and renewable energy as a similar problem, where how do we deploy on a massive scale, not just renewable energy and rooftop solar and things like that, but how do we retrofit and upgrade buildings? How do we, seal homes and make sure that homes are energy efficient in a way that respects people's, rights to private property, but also understands that we have a societal and civilizational demand and mandate to make sure that this planet is habitable. And just to be clear, if the US makes this transition rapidly, it doesn't mean the rest of the world will. But I don't think the US should be in a position where we're lagging the rest of the world, or at least industrialized nations. So the World War II mobilization is a model because when it was all said and done, more than 300,000 warplanes were built. And the story is already written on how World War II ended up. That would not have been possible without massive public investments, right? So the other piece of the Green New Deal, or the other point of inspiration, is the New Deal. So we get the economic ethos of the World War II mobilization, but there's also this social vision of the Green New Deal that comes from the New Deal. As you know, the country invented literally functions of government and its role in society during the New Deal era. Things like worker protections, rural electrification, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the public sector getting involved in aspects of our national life that up to that point it had not been involved in. And I think the folks of that time did not cower. It was not without controversy, obviously, but the leaders in that time did not cower from being innovative and seizing the opportunity to make substantive investments in the country, in the domestic economy, and in so doing, raising the standard of living in the U.S. And so the New Deal social vision, the Green New Deal social vision, finds its origin and root in the New Deal. But it's worth mentioning that the New Deal, and so, the New Deal is not all good, right? Like, it's definitely something that is in the public consciousness as an era where, literally it was a New Deal for the American worker, a New Deal for rural communities, et cetera. But we also understand that there was a politics of that time, just like we have a politics of our time that limits and constrains possibilities. And Ira Katznelson has this brilliant book, Fear Itself. And I'm going to read this quote because I think it's pretty appropriate and really helps frame some of the challenges that we're running into on this renewable energy front, right? So the quote begins, "The uncommonly wide repertoire of ideas and techniques that were considered and adopted during the New Deal era's chaos of experimentation," and I love that, right, "simply would have been impossible without the willing audacity of the segregated South. None of the early New Deal could have happened had the South not been convinced that the Democratic Party would continue to protect its racial order." In other words, FDR needed Southern Democrats in Congress to vote for his New Deal agenda. They had the enough votes. They had a block that could actually keep any New Deal legislation from passing. So historians note that the further south you went, the less you saw the economic and social impact of the New Deal. And the further north you went, like places in Chicago where I live, the more you saw the nationalization of the Jim Crow model, right? So because of the politics of that time, because of FDR's need to get New Deal legislation through the Congress, right, of his era, the New Deal is literally framed in what Katznelson calls the Southern cage. Basically, Jim Crow is baked into every New Deal program, right? So you get GIs who came home from World War II and couldn't use their GI benefits to buy a home because of redlining, et cetera, right? So it's a very interesting and complex history there. And I like bringing this up because I'll give you a little bit of backstory. Before this, package of proposals that's known popularly as the Green New Deal was even branded or labeled as the Green New Deal, we had a little bit of some pause with embracing the New Deal frame because of this history, right? Because, popular imagination, it's all good, but it wasn't all good, right? I live on the south side of Chicago in South Shore. Did a lot of work in Inglewood on the south side, used to live there. And these are both neighborhoods that have had to deal with redlining in a very real way for a number of decades, and a lot of which has not really ended for all intents and purposes. And so these types of policies, this Southern cage of the New Deal, still affects our economy today and diminishes the ability for families, Black families, to acquire wealth through home ownership, et cetera. So, history is layered, it's thick, it informs how we move forward. So what I do like about the Green New Deal frame, as much as we were ambivalent about that frame and label, even though it's very powerful, it does open up the possibility to understand and engage the question of how the public sector frames, right, our society, and how the public sector shapes the economy. And that's the point that we're making at New Consensus, where, we have to understand that markets, whether they be energy markets, and everybody who studies energy markets knows this, heavily regulated, shaped by the public sector, right? Labor markets are also shaped by the public sector, as are financial markets. And we ought to shape all of these markets to meet the needs of our society. And our most immediate need is to make sure that we can build things in the US once again, and also move to a clean and renewable energy future. So those are the historical kind of inspirations for this Green New Deal vision. And all of these together are remembered as the Green New Deal era, the New Deal and the World War II mobilization. And the idea is that we're tapping into this spirit of public investment, economic expansion, and common purpose that we believe can, accelerate the U.S. along this path, so that we can, not to be a cliche here, but to win the future. Because otherwise, we're going to be importing everything from other countries, and energy prices will be continued to set by somebody else, and American workers won't be able to work because Saudi Arabia and Russia disagreed, and then there was a global pandemic, right? So, but I'll pause there so we can have a discussion. But that's just generally our approach to things. We like to solve problems. We like to suspend what current politics says is possible today, and use history as a guide for understanding how big we can go, but also how the decisions we make as to who's included and who's not included matters for generations to come. And I'll stop sharing and we can have our discussion.
All right. Thank you very much for that good introduction, Damon. I'm just going to share one slide here as the starting point for discussion here. And it's something I recently, just saw on Twitter, but relates to what we're discussing here. So somebody posted this second Bill of Rights with FDR next to it, and I guess talking about his, hinting at his goals that were never fully achieved after the New Deal, if you will. Mm-hmm. And it's a economist here, Chinerva, who's saying, Green New Deal includes all these 1 through 6 things of a job, good wages, decent home, medical care, economic protection, and a good education. Nowhere in there is energy or green. We're not talking about energy. So this kind of is a common thing. I think when people talk about the Green New Deal, is it about energy? Is it about green energy or renewable energy? Is it about New Deal? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Or is it somehow both? Did you say, well, I like New Deal and I like green energy, I'm going to put them together and let's go with that in terms of your connecting the dots? How do you think about it, or how do you the concept come about?
And it might be a cop-out answer, but it's actually both, right? And I'll just give a quick example. It's an open secret that in certain zip codes, rooftop solar is basically a scam, right? Because, the nature of our, the financial sector and the real estate market and real estate financing really constrains a number of possibilities for energy efficiency upgrades and financing rooftop solar because one, you have to, have a certain credit rating, or two, your home should be worth enough or have increase in equity, and you can maybe borrow against that equity to put the rooftop solar. But if you're living in a neighborhood where, for a range of reasons that started in the 30s, and I would argue 400 years ago, right, that are artificially depressing home values, then there's not a lot of room financially to work with to finance an energy efficiency upgrade or put solar on your roof. So what happens? We put a lien on your house, right? And that's a very risky thing for the consumer to take on. And the list goes on and on and on. Interestingly enough, though, the best payers, the folks who are like in these zip codes that are really hard to figure out, they have the best loan repayment rates because they're going to pay their energy bill first, right? Like keep the lights on, right? So we have this weird market where there's a population that would benefit from energy savings, right? Because again, if you can upgrade a home to reduce its energy load and increase energy efficiency, you're at the same time not only helping us achieve a climate goal in a micro sense, but you're bringing that family's energy burden down, right? In Chicago, we have a really high energy burden, and our natural gas utility is going to be tripling rates. We're in this 5-year period where rates are tripling, and each year more and more families are sliding off the ratepayer rolls and need public assistance to, make their heat bill. The long story short is these two things work together. And so it looks like that we need great homes all across this country that are energy efficient. And in some cases, the family can afford it. In others, the lack of ability to afford it should not keep a home from getting the upgrade, right? And so I think this is where we have to be very creative and understand that this is a civilizational problem that we're solving, climate change, right? We're going to need to embrace a wider pot of money, and that would include public sector investments where we can offset the cost of these upgrades. One last thing, if we are required to have each upgrade or rooftop solar installation pencil out individually for each individual housing unit, we're never going to achieve these goals ever, right? Because if they penciled out, they would have already been done, right? So we need the public sector investments to shape the market, to create the market, treat it like the World War II airplane, right? And say, hey, like, me and my wife, we recently purchased our home about a year ago. What would compel us to make a long-term investment in energy efficiency with a 30-year or 20-year payoff? There are better things to do with that money, right? Right. For those who don't value the climate or energy efficiency benefit. So we can't, I'll end here and say, advocates of the Green New Deal have been critiqued in some corners by having like magical thinking, rainbows and butterflies. But I would argue that it is magical thinking to, kind of expect people to make private investments for things that don't benefit them directly, right? That kind of achieve some long-term climate goal, right? If we're going to wait for every building owner, every homeowner to have the highest energy efficient home or property, we're never going to achieve these goals. And so that's a long way of answering your question, where if you look at energy efficiency and emissions reduction, these two things go hand in hand, and having a energy efficient home that is of high quality also seems to marry well with the climate reduction, or emissions reduction. So these two go hand in hand. I think it's difficult to not see these two things as linked.
Right. Are you going, when you think about this, given the sort of historical context, racial or income inequality context, that would you say in some sense, well, the federal government, I don't know the right word here, I'll say owes, you're like, hey, financing low income or minority investments in the homes that they do live in via the government is a more just or equal way than financing it through the private sector, or that we couldn't expect, or maybe we shouldn't expect private lenders to want to engage in this activity. So it has to have this sort of government public spending approach to it. How do you say that?
So that's it. I want to say public financing is more just inherently. There's some public utilities out there that are like taking people's homes for like late water bills. So like, again, there's nothing morally, I don't know, like there's no like moral primacy to the public sector. But the point that we're making is there's a lot of capital in the public sector that can be unleashed to mobilize private capital, right? So in some cases, you would need a public investment to even spur private sector investment in that work. Again, let's use the energy efficiency upgrade as an example, right? It might take a government contract, right, to upgrade a group of buildings in order to tap a private sector loan, right, to increase capacity at a company to fulfill that contract. So it's going to be like our financial system, it's going to be a marriage of the two. And that's the point we're making. One of the difficult things to express in public these days is that we have this thing called the American system, and it includes the public sector. It also includes the private sector. And so, the Green New Deal, I don't want to get political on this forum, but I do want to just mention on the political environment, we have a national political culture where ideas like the Green New Deal are either too much public sector for people who are right of center, too big and too bold for people who are in the center, and then too much private sector for people who are to the left of center, right? And it is just, we can't even use good examples from our history to actually solve the problems in front of us, right? And we just won't have a country because we can't embrace practical solutions that really play to the strengths that the country has.
Right. So yeah, one of the questions on the Q&A now is sort of core to our discussion, so I'll keep trying to touch on that as we go along here. But you bring up, the World War II mobilization effort, and the question that we were going to discuss and what this person is asking is, let's just say that so the government spends money or finances or pays for certain infrastructure. How can we think about how that actually happens in World War II? According to Robert Gordon's book on the history of sort of American growth, the manufacturing capacity of the U.S. Essentially roughly doubled, and this was for the most part paid for monetarily by the U.S. government, and then private companies effectively own these factories after the war effort to then hire people and in some sense produce or be a large part of the prosperity that existed for the next 30 or so years, at least those engaged in that prosperity. So how many ways or what ways can we think about the government interacting? Do they put out bids for certain projects? Do they let companies suggest the projects that they should have for going low carbon or energy efficiency, and then pick the ones to invest? How can you imagine this, this government and private interaction, if you will?
That's it. I think, again, the mobilization for World War II and also the New Deal, these were eras of experimentation. So it's going to be a little bit of all of the above. Again, that's actually not a cop-out answer. That's actually how this is going to play out. So let's talk through a couple examples, and I'm going to kind of use this question in the Q&A to discuss what that looks like. So I'm going to start from the end here because it's pretty interesting. If public money is provided to companies, how would this benefit the average American? I would say the same way that it benefits, the average American for a company to get a contract to build an aircraft carrier, right? I think we need to, I'm not saying we just want to write checks to big companies, right? That's not what I'm arguing. But what I am saying is, this is an opportunity to inject public capital into our economy in a number of ways, right? This might be money for municipalities to own their utilities, right? This might be a way to actually fix PG&E, right? There's a way, and maybe make that a public, we don't, there's so many different options here. But to be clear, wait, excuse me, what?
Yeah, if the state of California or somebody wanted to own PG&E, so we can, it's another discussion,
right? But a different discussion. But the point here is that, and the PG&E kind of made me lose my point here, but the point I'm making here is, it's going to, how do I say this? It's not just about writing blank checks to companies, right? Like BP, right? But I think that would be not the best way to do it, right? I think it would be, financing projects, for example, deployment of solar farms, really, transitioning the workforce into these industries. I think an example could literally be, let's just kind of suspend politics for a moment, right? If we know there are industries that are becoming increasingly unviable, right? And these folks, particularly around coal, these communities that are built around these unviable coal plants, or in Illinois, there's several economically unviable nuclear plants, right? Can we use public money to make those workers whole with their pensions, right? And kind of ease the transition. There's different ways to use public money. And as long as that money is being put to productive use and doing things in our economy, it's not going to break the economy. Indeed, it's going to, kind of undergird the economy, and I think is going to grow the economy, right? So it says, how do we envision public investment working the Green New Deal? Would public dollars be provided to private companies looking to transition to? Yeah, I think again, from a building owner to GM, right? Is GM going to figure out how to build EVs all by itself? And that's the only thing it's building? How long will that take? We bailed them out in 2008, 2009. I think we can do a climate bailout, right? Among a range of industries, right? We had a troubled asset relief program in 2008. Could we have a toxic asset relief program? During COVID, we saw the Federal Reserve and the Treasury literally throwing the kitchen sink, into the financial system, right? Could we throw the kitchen sink at the climate crisis as well? The point that we're always making is, before we even get into the details of how this plays out, the big point is we can actually make this happen in a way that doesn't leave taxpayers, right, footing the bill or on the hook for a lot of stuff, but allow some accountability. So, even the Trump administration said, if we're bailing out the airlines, we would want to take an equity stake, right? These are just natural things that financial entities do, right? Because as the public sector makes people nervous, but a temporary, equity stake in a company as it transitions, and then the government gets bought out, this would be a very practical, sensible thing to do. So again, I stay pretty high level, but just kind of having that conversation and saying, hey, look, what if we operated like a financial institution, like the government? This is what we would do. This is what we demand. Nobody would write a blank check, right? And ask for nothing in return, right? That is what I think the American people won't abide. What they would abide is accountability and making workers, particularly and communities, whole. One last thing, I had the chief economist of the AFL-CIO find me at the ASSA, the Economics Association, the meeting in Atlanta in 2019. And he put his finger in my chest and said, what are you going to do about the hospitals in the towns that are built around, fossil fuel infrastructure? What are you going to do with them? And that's a damn good question, right? So we have to make people whole. The good news is that there's plenty of work to do. The downside is also people aren't Legos, right? It's oh, here's your job now. That doesn't sound right. But the point is, economies evolve, societies evolve. We are in that stage of evolution, and we just need to have very adult conversations. But I think we need to not be constrained with dollar amounts, because every dollar spent is a dollar spent in our economy, right? And it's an investment in securing our role in this transition. We should be selling stuff to other countries that's best in class. We should be building the next generation of solar panels, right? We should be the ones. We sell military hardware. We should be selling turbine licenses, right? and sending engineers to teach folks how to do stuff. We can be helpful and not hegemonic on the world stage and do our part. So that's the vision. And it's not detailed, because I think we are not even in the realm to even have detailed conversations yet. But the point is, we can use public money, and that money can be spent and used in an accountable way, particularly with the government having an equity stake in some of these companies. If they want it. If they don't, they're going to have to figure it out on their own.
Yeah, obviously you brought up a lot of issues there. Past examples of federal government interacting with, at least individuals to engage in the private sector. You mentioned GI Bill, paying for educations, obviously just building factories and creating infrastructure, the Green New Deal and World War II mobilization. You started talking about some things that are leading to what's different now than, let's just say, in the 30s and leading up to World War II. Examples are, debt loads, different types of interactions by at least the Federal Reserve and in the U.S. government, and bailing out, if you will, financial institutions as opposed to mortgage owners and paying off some of their actually debt or writing down mortgages. Some would claim that, there's there's too much private debt out there and it's never going to be paid back. And so, the government should effectively step in and just reduce the amount of debt in general. So let me just center on the idea you had of, let's just take coal workers, for example. Let's just say if there's no more coal extraction in the US and we're not exporting it or consuming it ourselves, and you have this community's infrastructure maybe hasn't been paid for and maybe they're out of work and they need training. Do you just see this as a similar thing as like a GI Bill? Well, everybody there, we'll train them if they want, but as you say, they're not Legos. I'm not sure what we do if they're sort of resistant to other kinds of educational training or moving. I guess you can pay to help people move. I don't know. How do you have you kind of thought about that? More on your people aren't Legos comment, I guess.
Yeah. And again, this is where, because people aren't Legos, I think there has to be acknowledgement that if this is, a national priority to transition away from certain modes of energy production versus just kind of less mandated, technology, like technological advancement that ends like clerical work and people who were like, typing on typewriter, cashiers at grocery stores, et cetera, right? Like, because this is not something that's like, kind of automatic, quote unquote. I think it is incumbent upon, policymakers and the public sector to do right by those workers in particular. We haven't even gotten to the shareholder question, right? A lot of those shareholders are pension funds, right? So this isn't a super clean, issue. Let's talk about oil and gas, right? I mean, ending subsidies on oil and gas is one thing. Like 30 years from now, not having as much oil and gas, that's a huge impact for the Gulf South. And just as I'm in the Gulf South, everybody knows that the folks who do pipe fitting in the Gulf South and do like the metal work, that same work is needed to do turbines, right? They're already doing it. The turbines in Maine are built in the Gulf South. It's already here, right? So, and that infrastructure needs less and less jobs and less workers each year. So the transition is already happening. I would argue this is federal policy kind of catching up with these local communities who already see the end in sight, right? But I think there's a way to make those folks whole. I think if the good news about electric vehicles is that they can be built anywhere. So, it doesn't have to be concentrated in the Midwest, as Elon Musk has pointed out in the deserts of California or wherever he is, building those Teslas in a tent factory. But there is a question about the Paycheck Protection Program. And I think that is, nobody's saying, shut down the banks because they are extremely corrupt because they mishandled the Paycheck Protection Program, right? But I do think that this is an example of having a federal policy and then just handing it over to private interests and letting them decide what happens with this federal money. That was probably the wrong way to engineer that program. And so I think that question from the anonymous attendee is an excellent point, right? Again, if we were to embrace that the public sector is not some enemy of the people, there might have been a better way to do that. And I think also what we learned in 2020 was that we don't have a way for the federal government to get, investment funds or cash infusions into Main Street. We figured out how to do it for Wall Street, but the Federal Reserve was able to move in ways that it could not move in 2008 because of the 2008, experience. Like, wow, we don't know how to get money to Main Street. So we had a little bit of capacity to do it this time around, but we see that capacity needs to be grown out even more. So how do we actually have, federal entities that are designed to invest in the economy to be able to actually invest in the economy versus using banks as the sole channel through which these funds can flow, right? Because we get issues like deep fraud in the Paycheck Protection Program, where literally they got the cash, got paid for every, I'm not sure they got paid for every loan, but they got the cash and then decided who could get it and who couldn't. And there was very little accountability on that front. that's probably the wrong way to do it. It did help a lot of people, but it's probably the wrong way to do it. This requires, I think the New Deal era reminds us, this might require, different, slightly new government functions. If efficiency is the goal, if learning from our mistakes is the goal, we might need some government functions that operate in an emergency to inject capital into the economy.
Yeah. So yeah, you brought up a big topic there. I don't know. I think I'll skip it here and maybe come back. But yeah, it does, fiscal policy, if you will, or spending by the government, how much should be mediated through private entities, including banks, versus not, if it's for the public good. I guess the modern monetary theorists are, of course, bringing up this conversation a lot more. Let's just go to a couple of questions online. Well, first one's kind of short here, just kind of asking about organization, New Consensus, and its funding sources or how it operates itself. I don't know. Is there anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, we raise money like every nonprofit from individual donors and foundations. So that's where we get our money from. Yeah, we're not like really an industry group or anything, so we don't have like a lot of solar and wind investors writing checks. But we have foundations and small dollar individual donors that support our operations. The goal is to get to more individual small donors because you get to kind of set your direction a lot, more independently. So the woes of the nonprofit sector, right? So.
Okay. So the other question here is really, I guess, perhaps at the core of New Consensus, the interactions between Green New Deal, or we might think about just energy sector and infrastructure in general, and the wealth gaps and or income gaps in the U.S. Do you have any of your favorite, ideas or program policy type ideas that try to help address wealth gaps and infrastructure as a pathway towards that? That's
right. Like my favorite set of ideas are those that kind of center around, the home. I was speaking with an energy leader here in Chicago. She was saying housing policy hovers as a mist around anything energy related, right? And again, my entire career has been, and even my, not to get too autobiographical, but after my parents' divorce, we lived in the hood, right, in San Antonio, and I went to college, and then when I moved off campus, I was in the hood. So I've spent most of my adult life in the hood, and as an organizer, as somebody who was doing local work and really saw that there were severe limits to what any group of neighborhood residents could do. There were severe limits to what a city could do, or even a state. That much of the problems that we were contending with were set at the federal level, and the stuff just rolled downhill. And we were just kind of inundated with numerous, you can't really call them policy failures because this is what the policy is designed to do, right? The hood is an artificially created kind of social phenomenon. I mean, the amount of subsidy that goes into concentrating people of low income and low wealth into certain pockets artificially is quite striking, right? And we haven't even gone to like, the food stamp and SNAP benefit stuff that really interacts, and it makes a weird space where you have entire business corridors where the only thing on the street are nonprofits and like publicly subsidized institutions. And that is not an economy, right? I say all that to say, when it comes to closing the racial wealth gap, there are some exciting things that we can do with a Green New Deal vision. When it comes to upgrading homes, there's a lot of these community action agencies that have these weatherization, contracts with the federal government. There are homes. I know in Chicago, the group that does it here in Chicago, 50% of the homes that they've identified to do these weatherization upgrades with, they have to pass on because the home needs a roof, or the amount of windows they would need to install just kind of exceed a kind of very small budget. And that's understandable. But what would it mean to not just be able to recapitalize, right? And allow these zip codes to capture the capital that was denied them for generations, right? Not by accident, on purpose, right? New Deal, right? On purpose, to be able to, like, anew capture public capital to recapture the value of these homes, right? That would be significant, right? And then who's doing the work, making sure that, there's a federal rule that needs to be brought back. It was an Obama era rule that says, you can mandate that the work conducted on a federal contract come from a particular geographic catchment area around that project. We can mandate that the firms doing the work be owned, right, by the folks who live in the area. There's so many creative things that we can do with our policy that can really make this transition beneficial, not just for the environment and for human habitation, but for the economy as well, and really correct some wrongs that need to be corrected, right? Otherwise, we're going to keep having saddlebags on the American economy. So those are kind of like that level of discussion around like homes and the firms doing the work on the homes, right? And the reasons why it's hard to tap private capital to upgrade these homes. Those are the most interesting questions for me because they're very tangible, they're very concrete. And when you talk about it with electricians, carpenters, they get excited because they see it, right? Talk to a electrician who loves solar, who lives in the hood, and they're like, how do we do this? And so that's where public capital comes into play. And that electrician who loves solar should get the contracts. And that should be written into the letter of law. That's the only way we can keep this from having Amazon and Tesla own everything, right? That's not the economy we want. We'll have a unequal, environmentally sustainable economy where people are delivering meals in self-driven electric vehicles. And that's not an economy, right?
Right. You touch on a couple things there. I'll see if I can maybe try to come back to one as sort of a quote unquote more productive economy, which someone could envision, automatic cars delivering food to my house in terms of it's productive, in terms of it's lower, higher value add divided by costs, and labor is a cost. So in some sense, if you can get rid of labor costs, then you're more productive. Some people have say, well, at least for the OECD or US countries, maybe we have enough consumption and we might have to think about being less productive in the sense of sharing work more equally amongst people instead of just trying to be purely economically productive in this sense. And this really gets into the ties and the understanding between how we think about what the economy is and how we think about how the economy operates, which is a little about what my research is about, and what's the real role of energy extraction and doing work in that engineering or thermodynamic sense and economic output. So how have you thought, I think we met at a kind of high level meeting with high level thinkers thinking about investments in the economy. And do you think there's enough knowledge about sort of the interaction of resources and the economy, energy, the difference between fossil energy and renewable energy economy, and just, economic growth and wages and these kinds of things? Are you engaged in anything like that? Or
no. So my answer to that is no, which is why, I think we hit it off at that meeting because it taps that question where it's difficult to talk about energy without thinking about economy, right? And so, kind of operating in these silos would be counterproductive in actually solving a problem. I would like, Carey, for you to kind of, comment on, the kind of high level vision and some of the ideas that I threw out without any responsibility for, owning the execution or even mapping out exactly how it would work, because I think we're at that kind of ideation phase and kind of public framing phase of this whole work. But Carey, I would love, in light of that question, because I know you've dived into this, I would love to get your response and comment on not the Green New Deal per se, but this idea of public investment for energy transition, what that would do in the domestic economy, and how we think about economy matters for a sustainable future, right? Just roughly speaking.
All right.
Can I do that? Was that all?
Well, yeah. Yeah, yeah, I guess so. You're the guest. I'll do what you like. I'll say a couple of things just short on that. One is I had an exchange with someone on Twitter, and they were discussing how it's these economic rules. Some of the things you're talking about that are holding the economy back. It's bad economic policy or tax. For the most part, let's just say tax policy, how we tax wages versus capital gains or something like this. And as you pointed out, I've been interested in understanding the role of energy in economic growth in general, or in distribution as well. So not size and structure. Is the economy big or small, and what's its shape? How are things distributed? If anything where you have some stuff, money, energy, concrete, whatever it is, how much goes to here versus there? That's anything that talks about that as structure. So the old labor versus capital battle, if you will, is a way to talk about structure. So you could have the same size economy, but two different structures, and you can discuss which one you like better. And so this person on Twitter was like, I think you're complicating it too much by talking about the sort of energetic basis of the economy. And I said, well, I guess it is more complicated to go through two steps, which is energy to the economy and then rules about policy and how it affects social outcomes. As it is, it's more complicated to do both of those linkages than just one of them, but I find it necessary as an academic to study them. And I think the energy economy linkage is less understood. But one summary that I make in my book that just came out, The Economic Superorganism, is it's kind of a 5-step way of thinking. So first, physical laws and constraints describe how we can use and access energy. We come up with laws of physics effectively to understand this. Second, energy resources physically power the economy in machines and buildings and other physical capital. Things don't move unless they consume energy and take it from one form to another. So that's a necessity. The third thing is our interpretations of the economy inform policy. So if our interpretations of the economy don't include the concept of how energy is required to do stuff, we'll end up with policy that's ill-informed. So the fourth thing is that policy affects social outcomes. So this is the other thing I already pointed out. You've pointed this out. Policy is coming up with rules, regulations, market rules, rules for taxes, things that affect distribution and structure within the economy. And so there's this whole possibility of things the economy could do, and these regulations are actually restricting it in some sense. The laws of physics allow many other things to occur, but these are restricting those possibilities. The last thing is that these rules in turn govern how things are invested, who gets money, and that in turn affects how we consume energy. So you kind of come all the way back full circle. So it's, physics, energy, economy defines the economy, which informs policy, which affects social outcomes. So to me, without understanding how energy defines the economy, I can't actually make the linkage to social outcomes all the way. So I'm working to do that. With that said, I have another, this is the other question I was going to ask you earlier when you were talking about the hoods. In some sense, how much detail is enough? You talk about staying high level with new consensus. When is too much detail a hindrance, or do you get people that sort of say, hey, do you really know what you're talking about? Start giving me some details. How do we know if their purpose is to just kind of bog you down in details versus actually, come up with constructive solutions? And in particular, I'll just throw out one thing for your hoods. Should the federal government let's just say you bought out landlords in the hoods, and now the people living there owned it, and it's up to them to determine how to invest themselves and improve their homes, because now they would in a sense own them. So you made me think of that idea. So I'm just, if you thought of that, but go ahead, both questions, details and just buying out debt.
Yeah. So the details question is a great one, because every time, I won't go into the sad history of some of this work, but we've worked with folks who are really good on details. And what we've learned is that unless we figure out, and this is why I love talking to you, Carey, unless we figure out what we're talking about and then what's possible and understand the connections at some broad level in ways, and I think, Carey, your work is incredible because we don't have these linkages, like we don't have an intellectual basis like that is like broadly comprehended and apprehended to even have these discussions at the policy level, right? And so the folks who come in and know policy are operating in this kind of very siloed way where they talk about like, oh, incentives. And it's like, do you know what that means? Like, what are your assumptions that go into that word? Tell me that you're just kind of taking things off the shelf without kind of diving deeper into why do we need incentives, right? Why would we need grants versus loans, right? Like, so let's figure out what we're talking about. So that's been as much detail as we want to go in. We keep kind of almost bouncing back up to, I don't want to call it theory, but to practicing having these framing conversations that one, make the case for public investment in ways that don't sound scary, normalizing public investment, which is a lot easier now, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. I mean, it was just there's money going everywhere. Like, and people expected it, Carey, right? People expected the federal government to come up with the resources to make things happen, right? 2019, it was hard to talk about what the federal government could do. People now see the federal government can do a whole lot and still fall short, right? Which is quite kind of jarring a bit, right? And so we're really trying to figure out how to even have a conversation around public investment, and practicing having a conversation in different audiences and crafting the language that doesn't get too technical, because there still has to be a public awareness of how this is going to go. This is not a technocratic problem that we have to solve. At the end of the day, it's a kind of societal and small p political problem. And so the general public has to understand the problem and what's possible. And even if you don't think, I think folks are concerned about climate, but it may not be as high as they claim it is on their level of priorities. But I think the ability to have an income, the ability to have the means of making a living, right? These things matter. If you can connect these things together on a kind of policy and political level, it makes a lot of sense. I think you can actually get it done. The kind of same connections you're making, Carey, at the intellectual level, right? Connecting economy and energy. We have to do the same thing politically. Otherwise, we're talking about things in ways that human beings don't experience them, right? Which is, the economy broadly, whatever the hell that means, and then my energy bill, I guess. Like, people are just out here just trying to figure out how to live their lives, right? So we got to make this super simple. So what you're doing intellectually, and I'm not saying we agree, right? Like, I think part of our conversations are how we kind of have a great productive back and forth. But the linkages that you're crafting intellectually on the academic front are the linkages that we're trying to figure out how to connect on the kind of public discourse front. So it's pretty exciting. So I call it the appropriate level of detail. For me, if we can have an idea that public investments are good for the economy and lead to economic expansion, right? And that can happen in a number of ways. Let's get that conversation going and then figure out the ways after that.
Yeah, not that I'm the super economic historian. I know enough to say something dangerously wrong, but but that's the Keynesian idea, right? Government can lead spending and growth, and then that occurred from the 30s until through the 60s, and then after that, the oil crises and peak oil production. Then we've changed into this less regulation and more purely market-oriented framework. In some sense, you're back to the future, really, right? You're saying, well, hey,
no, that's right.
It's Green New Deal, right? It's back to using the old terminology. So I'll just say maybe one more thing. You brought up the economy, whatever that is. And in my research in my book, as far as I could tell, the concept of the economy came out in the 1930s as like a thing to even talk about. So it's maybe 90 years old. Someone can correct me. And interestingly, it's about the same time as the idea of an ecosystem came about in biology, that there is, a connection of organisms that live in an environment, and then they have these, interconnections amongst themselves and depend upon themselves. Economy is effectively the extension of that idea. I think they were independently derived, but essentially the extension of that idea. Also, I just kind of went to something here. I quoted a researcher from Columbia, Timothy Mitchell, and he would claim that this idea of the economy actually sort of was derived to counteract some sort of populist tendencies within the economy, right? So instead of talking about people, you're talking about this thing called the economy, right? And that kind of dominates discussion. I find value in the concept of the economy, and I also find value in talking about people too. But we can sort of ask ourselves, what are we trying to do? Help the economy or help people? And this is the core structure. Maybe we could end here on any of your thoughts on that. Or can we help people, or can we help more people due to the wage income and wealth disparity? Can we help a majority of people, and let's just say theoretically, not even shrink the economy from a GDP stance, or even keep it constant, right? Can a higher number of people have a better livelihood, even if the economy doesn't grow in the traditional or common sense of talking about it? And we can maybe end on your thoughts on that question.
Well, Carey, that's where you outpace me. But I will say I'll agree with your last point where the words and frames that we use matter in how we even perceive the problem and consider a range of solutions that's on the table. There's a group of folks that I conspire with. We had a retreat in last December, and we're supposed to be meeting during the year. We know how that went. But one of the ideas, to the point you made, Carey, on the economy being this abstraction that is almost like removed from people, is to talk in ways that kind of reclaim, like, we are the economy, right? Like, it's not something out here that we talk about, but we are the economy. And so if we are not doing well, right, it's the economy is not doing well, right? If a smaller and smaller amount of people are doing quite well, and then more and more people are doing quite poorly, the economy is not doing well. And so sometimes the numbers that we talk about don't really reflect, the reality on the ground, and tend to distract Washington from really meeting the needs of the American people. And again, this is just, making decisions of policy, to the point you made, that makes sense. And this is from trade on in, right? So, it's a very exciting time. I don't want to talk about trade because that's a whole thing that we could, let's get sued by the WTO, right? Like that's the goal, right? So, right, and then litigate it in court, we've got to really make sense, right? And so build stuff in the U.S. And the only way to get that done is to have public sector investments that are accountable to the people, and do so in a way that has an eye for how our society is constructed, which is not an accident. It was by design. So we should acknowledge that and design it differently. And I think it's going to be something that a lot of folks can get excited about. So, yeah.
All right. I think that's a great place to leave it with you saying, let's not pretend that our economy as it is not been designed in some sense by some people, humans, creating rules and winning their arguments. And we can think about doing that in different ways. So enjoyed our conversation as we've had in the past, this time recorded and in front of others. So thank you, Damon Drummer, co-founder and executive director of New Consensus. Thank you for being part of the UT Energy Symposium. And with that, we will conclude.